This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything, from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 224 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Paula Wyman, author of Bad Naturalist, about her ecological education on a wild Virginia mountaintop. The plant profile is on treasure flower, and we share what's going on in the garden as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on 2025 garden resolutions from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode we're joined by Paula Wyman. She is the author of Bad Naturalist, one woman's ecological education on a wild Virginia mountaintop. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you so much.
It's great to have you, and we're going to talk all about what a bad naturalist you are. We'll probably define some of those terms as well. But on the GardenDC podcast, we like to ask all our guests, were they born with chlorophyll in their vein and a green thumb?
Well, that's a great question. And as I describe in the book, I was not a good gardener. But when I was a kid, I was very into insects, and that's how I ended up coming to plants eventually now through my interest in insects and other wildlife. But when I was, I was living in the city in DC, and about 25 years ago, we moved to the suburbs, and that's when I realized that you almost can't live in the Washington suburbs if you don't garden. So I thought, okay, I'm going to learn to garden now. And I planted some bulbs and I planted various different things, and everything would work fine the first year, and then it wouldn't come back or would get eaten or it would just die. And I had terrible luck. Luckily, my husband is wonderful with gardening and landscaping, and so I could leave it to him. But no, I finally in the book, I explained that I decided I had to have a theory of not gardening. I had to have an explanation for why I didn't garden, besides that I was bad at it. So that's why when I decided to take on this project, it was sort of counterintuitive. I had really so little knowledge about plants, other than the plants that I did become preoccupied with through the years when I sort of would do a deep dive on some particular animal or insect or plant. For instance, I became very interested for a long time in mangrove trees. And so at the time I learned a lot about mangrove trees, but there aren't any mangrove trees in this meadow. So that doesn't help me at all.
Nope. And did you have any childhood memories from a relative in the garden?
Yes. My mother, the first place we lived, which was in Silver Spring, like I said, where I grew up, my mother had a rose garden, and she really loved these roses. And unfortunately, our German Shepherd at the time liked to eat them. And and they're toxic for dogs. So she finally became worried enough about it that she took them out. But that house had some really interesting plants that we would now consider exotic. But what I found out when I did some research on those plants was that the one that I particularly liked, that was my favorite, was the pussy willow, and that was a native plant. Mm-hmm. So I was that was always sort of a sentimental favorite of mine. And when we moved to another house in Silver Spring, my mother planted a big vegetable garden on this sunny side of the house, on this sort of steep hillside. And we grew, and I helped her with it, helped in quotes, I guess. I was a kid. But we grew peppers and tomatoes, and we even grew corn. And, they wouldn't come out perfectly. Like the carrots were kind of stubby. And now from reading more, I think I know why that happened. but we would put out beer to kill the slugs and stuff like that. But that was a really interesting experience. And I think from that, I found an interest in sort of utilitarian gardening, if I could describe that, because I liked the idea of growing vegetables, something that I could use, even though I absolutely love seeing other people's gardens and going to wonderful gardens like Longwood and Mount Cuba and seeing what people have done and what organizations have done with their gardens. It's just not something I feel capable of doing.
So let's talk a little bit about your writing background and the other books that you've worked on.
Sure. Well, I've been a writer pretty much all my life. From the time I was a little kid, I would line up my stuffed animals and force them to listen to my stories.
Sounds like a podcast.
Yeah. If only I'd known. And then in the 6th grade, I wrote a story collection for an assignment, and I won a prize for it. So that sort of kept me going. And my next story collection I wrote in 2016. It came out in 2016, and it was called You May See a Stranger. It was a linked short story collection that followed the life of one woman for about 35 years, and it was all set in Washington, D.C. And let's see, I've also been an editor for many, many years in different capacities. I was an editor for some real estate trade magazines, and I was an editor. I was a book editor at the American Psychological Association in DC for several years. And I've been an editor of a literary journal for the past 7 years.
So let's move on to Bad Naturalist and what sparked writing that book. But I think we need to rewind a little bit and talk about what sparked even going and moving from the DC area to the Blue Ridge.
Well, my husband and I had been interested in moving to the countryside for a long time. And it was the kind of thing we couldn't really think about in earnest until our kids were launched. And that happened around 2019. So that's when we started looking in earnest, and we were looking for a small, farmhouse we could fix up, or a cabin or something where I could plant a small meadow and maybe raise a few sheep. I was really interested in doing that. And I had the planting of a native meadow in mind because even though I'm not a traditional gardener, I've always been very interested in conservation, and I've been doing a lot of reading about bringing back native plants to your yard, that Doug Tallamy's Nature's Best Hope, and about rewilding, the idea of returning land to nature that's been disturbed, specifically Isabella Tree's book, Wilding. And I was really inspired by those books, and I had all of that in my head, and that's why I wanted to plant this little meadow. And I had this sort of vision of myself in a little writer's studio, like a shed kind of building in the middle of this beautiful meadow, which is very idealistic. And so we were looking for, like I said, a small place. And while we were looking, we learned about this mountaintop only because it was supposed to have incredible views. And so we came up here while we were looking just to see the views. And if I could set the scene for you a little bit, it was the middle of August. It was hot and bright. And the road is very steep. It's about a 30-degree grade. And it's a gravel road. And at that time, the last maybe quarter to half mile of road was not a road. It was a hike. It was rocks and roots. So we had to park at the bottom of the road and walk up. And when we got up to the top, there was a narrow trail that had been mowed because the place hadn't really been in use for some years. And they had mowed a trail just so people could come up and see the view. And when we got to the top, I looked out, and around me, there were these yellow flowers that were over my head. They were 6 feet plus high. There were bees buzzing all around. There were birds, unfamiliar bird song. And I looked out over this rolling meadow where I saw more and more of these yellow flowers. And it was so beautiful. And the Blue Ridge was silhouetted, on the horizon, and forested hillsides. And it was just so unlike anything I'd seen in this area that I was really blown away. And I thought, well, what am I thinking about this tiny meadow that I was going to plant when here is this like vast field, old fields right in front of me, that what could I do here? Just think what I could do here. And suddenly I just decided that that's what I wanted to do, that I wanted to do something really big and ambitious, despite the fact that I didn't know anything about plants, and despite the fact that I didn't know how to do it, what questions to ask, whom to ask. I really didn't know anything, but something in my gut just said, this is your next deep dive. And it may last for a while.
Yes. So I do want to ask, for those listeners who are outside the Washington, D.C. region and Mid-Atlantic, they might not be familiar with the Blue Ridge Mountains and the topography and geology of that. So can you describe kind of where it's located, I guess in relation to some major cities in the area, and then what type of soils and climate and growing conditions?
Oh, wow. Well, the Blue Ridge is part of the Appalachian mountain chain that really extends from all the way north. How far north? I'm not really sure. To the south, like Georgia, maybe. Mm-hmm. And the Blue Ridge is part of that. A lot of people have heard of Shenandoah National Park, which is in the northern Blue Ridge, and the mountain that I'm on is in the foothills of the Blue Ridge, which you could also call it the Piedmont, which is east of the Blue Ridge. And the farther east you go from the Blue Ridge, the smaller these foothills get. And we're rather close, so this is one of the taller Piedmonts, I guess. And let's see, what else can I tell you about it? So Shenandoah National Park is one of the well-known places in the Blue Ridge, and that's only it's a few miles across the valley from me. I don't know if that helps to situate it. And the Blue Ridge is I think it's one of the oldest mountain chains in the world, which is why it's not so tall. It has eroded over time. And but it's 1 billion years old. And the reason that they know that is the rock that they've found in various places proves that it was connected with rock mountains in other parts of the world. And of course they can age fossils and things like that. I'm not an archaeologist, but I did a lot of reading about it. I'm not a geologist, but I did a lot of reading about it, and it was fascinating to me. And you can even see it on the mountain here, that we have tons of rock outcroppings, and some of them are granite. Some of them are something called greenstone. I haven't been able to find out what that is. And then we have quartz also. Mm-hmm. Some parts of the mountain are quartz, and there's slate. There are, and they tend to be in separate areas. So it's very interesting. And what was the last part you asked me?
A little bit soil. About soil growing conditions.
Well, this is this mountaintop. First of all, the meadow is about 75 acres, and it's been open for hundreds of years. So it's kind of unusual to have that open area on top of a mountain. And the soil here is dry and erodible and rocky. So one of the reasons why it's so well suited for native plants is that's why, because you would have to, if you wanted to really farm up here, and I'm not sure why you would want to do that. It's very steep and kind of forbidding, but you would have to really enrich the soil quite a bit to do that. And I'm sure someone must have done that at some point, because it was from the early 1800s. It was an apple orchard for about 150 years. And then for about 50 years, it was cattle pasture. And when it was converted to cattle pasture, they grew a lot of hay grasses up here. And the hay grasses must have needed more nitrogen. So I'm not sure how it was treated before I got here. The only way I can tell is by looking at the evidence, and the evidence is in what's growing. So there's a lot of orchard grass, there's a lot of fescue, there are a lot of hay grasses, and all of that is mixed in with the native plants that are able to make it through the sort of dense mat formed by those non-native grasses.
Yeah, we had a guest on the podcast talking about southern apples, and she's also not too far from you in her location, but a lot of those Piedmont, we could call them hills, small mountains, were mountain orchards because of their great drainage and great soil, and obviously it's nice and sunny, and the occasional rain helps a lot, so you don't have to irrigate them in addition.
That's right. And there's far less danger of frost. So it was really a perfect place to grow apples for a very long time, until, I guess, what happened was Washington State and New York State took over the apple business, and it became, and basically most of the orchards were transitioned to cattle.
That makes sense. So let's turn to your book, Bad Naturalist. And of course, I have to ask you first about the title.
Well, it's funny because this is a memoir, and that was something that was I'm not used to writing about myself. I wrote fiction. Fiction, you can make things up. Memoir, you have to talk about yourself, and it has to all be factual and true and everything. But I was focused on the land in my mind when I was thinking about the book. So I originally had a working title that focused on the land. And then my publisher actually suggested this very catchy title, Bad Naturalist, which I love. But it initially, I was thinking, oh, wait, now it's about me. And that was but it's very apt because, like I said, when I came here, I really didn't know anything about plants, and I've learned so much. And I felt like I was making mistake after mistake after mistake. But what really Bad Naturalist really means to me is that the way I learned that in conservation, there is no one right way. There is no one perfect approach that works no matter what. Even on one end of this piece of land, it might not work the way it does on the other end. It's certainly not something that can be applied to every piece of land, even in a given geographical region. And with every decision, there are trade-offs. Everything I did had a potential negative effect on something else. Everything I did that was positive to try to reach a positive solution or direction had some potential negative impact. And that was really hard to come to terms with. So,
yeah, I think anytime that you're digging in the soil or making a decision of, I'm going to move this plant here or I'm going to plant this new here, you're making those type of trade-offs. Like you're not planting something else or you're disturbing or moving something else. Can you describe some of those trade-offs and hard decisions you made?
Sure. One of the big problems here, I guess about 80% of my attention is on managing invasive plants. And I don't say getting rid of them because that's almost impossible to totally get rid of them in a place like this, but trying to keep them from expanding, trying to keep back new plants that are undesirable. And when I'm dealing with invasive trees, well, it's pretty easy to directly treat a tree without harming anything else. But when you're talking about, say, Japanese honeysuckle or spotted knapweed, and these plants are mixed in throughout the field with all of these other native plants, things I don't want to harm. So I could be spot spraying forever, and there's no way I could go into the meadow and pull every spotted knapweed plant. First of all, they have really strong roots, but second of all, it's just not realistic. And even if I wanted to spray individual plants, it's very complicated. With Japanese honeysuckle, actually, you can do it in the winter because it's still green. So right now, when most of the native plants are already dormant, I could go in and spot spray or pull the Japanese honeysuckle. But it's so widespread here and it's such a large area that there's almost no way to do it without having an impact on something else.
And when you say you're spot spraying, are you using glyphosate or what are you using?
I try not to. I mean, I really do very little spraying unless I can directly spray something. Also because there are areas here that are so steep and rolling hills, and I don't want the runoff from the spray. So even if I'm spot spraying something, it still could get washed into a stream if it rains, and I'm very conscious of that. So I've really tried to manage by bush hogging, hand pulling, burning, and minimizing the spraying as much as possible. So, but I have spot sprayed, for instance, mile-a-minute vine, because otherwise, if you don't, what happens is it smothers everything. And it stays there for months. Even when it's dead, it's still there, and it still has seeds on it that can be viable, and you could spread it by trying to remove it. And then when other things try to grow through it, it shades them out, and it's just a mess.
Yeah, and I think for those of us who want to organically garden and not use any chemicals, that is one of those trade-offs and hard decisions that you were talking about.
Exactly. And I don't want to sound at all like, when I say I don't think of myself as a gardener, it's because traditionally I was so bad at it. And I really do admire the ability of people like my husband, actually, to just grow plants, like to set out to do that, and it actually works for them. I don't know, maybe I'd be better at it now.
So, and when you're establishing or clearing your meadow, planting, you were obviously taking out the invasives or undesirables. Are you immediately planting or by seed replacing them?
I'm actually neither, because one of the things I learned here early on, I was lucky enough to have experts in various different fields who were willing to come out here and walk with me and see what was growing and talk to me about what they thought would be the best approach for different aspects of the project. And one of the very first things I learned from a conservation biologist was that there are, or at least they suspected there were, a good concentration of native plants in the seed bank. And that planting here, for the most part, trying to seed would not be advisable. First, because maybe we didn't need to, because of the seed bank. They could see from the native plants that were here that there were these plants in the seed bank, and they suspected that once we got the dense non-native grasses out of the way, some other natives would have room and access to light and nutrients and be able to grow. And the other reason is because a lot of these fields are highly erodible, there was no safe way to seed, because the methods of seeding where you have to make furrows or disking, any of those kinds of things would have caused disturbance that could have led to runoff and erosion. So there are a few places where there are small areas that are flat enough where I could try it. And I have talked with a couple of experts who advised me that if I wanted to do an experimental patch, they've pointed to a couple of places where I might try that. My attention has first been the other problem actually with disturbing the soil here is that there are also a lot of invasive plants here. And if you disturb the soil in the wrong way, when you have those plants and on a large scale, when you're talking about an acre or more, you could end up having an acre of, knotweed or stilt grass. And stilt grass is a particular problem because it grows at the same time the native plants grow, and you can't. So there are limited ways to deal with that. I wouldn't want to spray it because I would have to spray in season. So it's really about pulling it. Anyway, so I haven't planted yet because I'm still in the stages of seeing what grows when I do different things to different fields.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the genius ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Why are there ridges on Reese's peanut butter cups? Probably so they never slip from her hands. Could you imagine? I'd lose it. Luckily, Reese's thought about that. Wonder what else they think about. Probably chocolate and peanut butter.
And in the book, you describe having consultations, I guess, or visits with Charlotte Lorick.
Oh, yes.
With Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, which is a mouthful. And you call her a plant guru.
Yes.
And talk about how she came and helped you ID things and helped out with the field botany and biodiversity. Tell me some of the things you learned from Charlotte.
Oh, Charlotte is wonderful. First of all, I will say she is now with Oak Spring Garden Foundation.
Ah, okay.
She is their head of their meadow restoration, their ecological restoration there. And in fact, I'm in conversation with her this month at Oak Spring Garden. She was one of the first people who came out. She was with a branch of the Smithsonian called Virginia Working Landscapes that focuses on large pieces of land that are privately owned in Virginia to try to see what kind of species are growing on those large private lands and to help bring back native birds, especially grassland birds and native grassland plants. And they do various studies and research. So one of the things they do is occasionally come out and do a survey. So she came and did a plant survey, and Virginia Working Landscapes also did a bird survey when I was first starting this project. So that was about 3.5 years ago. And that way we had a baseline. I could see, okay, these are the plants we know we have. These are the birds we know we have. And now, in fact, they're going to do another survey in this spring so that we can see how things have changed. But Charlotte is one of these people who can identify plants even in winter when, they're dried and they don't look like themselves anymore, at least to me. Mm-hmm. And so she could walk through the field and point and just tell me exactly what everything was. And that really helped me to learn. And I would occasionally email her a photograph and say, "What's this?" And she would tell me. And she also was very helpful in when I wanted to pinpoint particular fields for prescribed burns. She gave me really good advice about that. And she is definitely a plant person in every way. She just knows so much about plants. And one of the things that she points out is that a lot of times people don't pay attention to plants. She does a TED Talk where she shows a slide where a bird is sitting on a tree branch. And she asks people what's in the picture, and the first thing they talk about is the bird. They don't pay any attention to the plant that the bird is sitting on. And the plant, by the way, was a native black cherry. So that was a really interesting experience for me to have, talking to Charlotte on several occasions. She came out here a few times, and just being able to learning to reorient myself to pay attention to plants. And now that's something that I do all the time. I walk through the meadow and I look to see if I see something that's different or what stage every plant is at. And in fact, I was walking with someone else recently who found an orchid in the meadow that I had never seen before.
Wow.
And that was really exciting. It was a lady's tresses orchid. And it was a tiny little thing. It was the kind of thing, amid all of these other, this other mess of plants. And if she hadn't been, that was Beth Mizell, who used to be director of Blue Ridge Prism, actually, and is now with the Shenandoah National Park Trust. So, and if she hadn't been with me, I probably wouldn't have picked out that plant.
Wow. And yeah, that return visit for the study is going to be so fascinating for you to see those changes. So we'll be looking forward to hearing about that. And you had mentioned Doug Tallamy and a few others. So I wanted to ask you about your maybe horticultural heroes or influences, especially in the writing of this book.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Doug Tallamy, is the star of bringing back native plants, and his work just really inspired me and got me to think about my suburban yard in a different way. it had never occurred to me to think about native plants versus non-native plants, really not until the past several years. And so we had planted a butterfly bush. I had planted, and it was the wrong kind of butterfly bush. I learned. And, but at the time, those many years ago when that was planted, we thought we were doing the right thing. We want to attract butterflies. So plant a butterfly bush. Who knew? And now I'm really adamant about anything new that we plant being a native plant. And I even brought seeds from the mountain and planted them in the suburbs from milkweed seeds and gave them out to some neighbors there. So Doug Tallamy was a big inspiration for that. And I have a very proudly display a homegrown national park sign now at the entrance to the meadow. And Isabella Tree, her book Wilding, as I mentioned, is was the big inspiration for me when I was looking out at this land, thinking, well, okay, if she could do that with a 3,500 acre farm with clay soil, I can do that here at this place where already there is probably a lot of good stuff growing. And I was just so jazzed by her whole project and the idea of bringing in animals, that because rewilding often includes animals, not just plants. So you're bringing in animals that help create and maintain the right habitat for those plants. And the idea, so here, for a while, I was thinking, I wonder if I could introduce bison, because there would have been bison and elk on this mountain back when. But I finally came to the conclusion that wasn't practical. You can't really fence bison, and you can't safely wander in the meadow when you have bison. But cattle are, a lot of people are using cattle as a substitute, and Tree introduces a type of, maybe a couple of types of cattle to her land with good success. Now, they in England, of course, they have a whole different experience of invasive plants than we do here, and in part because I think they don't have a whole lot of native plants left because of the farming culture that but here, at least in Virginia, we're very fortunate that those native plants are in the seed bank, and if you make it possible for them to grow, they often will.
And in the book, you were mentioning deer in chapter 9, and I was thinking of that as your bison substitute that's naturally probably come in. And do you have heavy deer pressure?
Oh my
on
goodness!
Your property?
Oh my goodness! Yes, that was when the Department of Forestry came out and looked at the understory in our woods, because we have about 140 acres of wooded, forested slopes around the meadow, and the understory is very depleted, and the reason for that is deer.
Yep.
Deer eat the native plants, and they leave the non-native plants for the most part. They carry seeds in on their bodies like other wildlife from stilt grass. And stilt grass gets in, garlic mustard gets in, nothing eats those two plants, and they take over in the woods. And the deer prevent the regeneration of oaks, particularly white oaks, which are a keystone species here. And the deer eat the seedlings, they eat the white oak acorns, as do many other creatures, because they taste better than the red oak acorns. And in that sense, the oaks are threatened. And it would be fine if the deer were at a manageable level, and I talk about it a little in the book. There's a carrying capacity. One is cultural, which is how many deer are okay with you, and then there's a biological carrying capacity, which is there enough food for them? And this area is just completely overrun with deer. I can see it anytime we look at our trail camera. We'll be wading through literally thousands of pictures of deer to find the one of the bear. And so the Department of Forestry said, you need to get rid of your invasive plants before you can improve the understory, you must reduce the number of deer. And so that's when I realized we would need to allow hunting. And it wasn't something that was part of my, I didn't really know much about hunting except what I saw growing up. And it just wasn't something we did. We lived in the suburbs, and we did have a neighbor who was a deer hunter. So I knew a little bit, but I had to get past my, isn't Bambi cute phase in order to be okay with that. But now I have joined. Virginia has a program called the Deer Management Assistance Program, which I always think is a really funny, like a funny way to say we're going to help you kill more deer. We're going to assist the deer. Management assistance. But basically, as long as you provide statistical information about the deer that are harvested, you're allowed more tags. So I can request however many tags we think we need, and then the hunters don't have to use their own individual allotment, as long as they're taking does. If they take bucks, they have to use their own. So we're in the first year of that. So it's a sort of a probationary year, and next year we'll get extra tags, and they require you to weigh the deer once they've been field dressed, and also send in a piece of the deer's jawbone. So at the end of the season, so the hunter has to be willing to collect that information and just write it down, and then collect a piece of the jawbone. At the end of the season, it all gets sent in to the Department of Wildlife Resources so that they can track the size and health of the population and the age and so on.
Interesting. And so you had said earlier one of your goals was sheep, and I assume maybe you were into knitting or that type of thing. But I'm assuming sheep did not come.
Not yet. Sheep are still in my long-term plan. We have enough space here that I could keep a small number of sheep, but my primary goal is to improve the health of the meadows here and encourage native plants and tip the balance toward native plants. And once that happens, I'll feel more comfortable bringing in sheep and maybe some goats in a limited area. And in fact, I don't know how to knit, but it's one of those things I would probably learn, right? I'd have to learn. I learned how to groom a poodle. So I can probably, I don't know, grooming sheep probably, shearing sheep probably a little more difficult. But I had this idea that I wanted to raise dairy sheep and make sheep milk cheese.
Okay.
And I don't, that also seems incredibly labor intensive. I know that there was one dairy sheep farm in Maryland that was, very well regarded, and I think they just closed. So I don't know if it's realistic for me to take that on, but I'm still thinking about it. I think I have enough to do right now with this meadow.
Yeah, I think you've tackled a lot, and I don't want to let you go before I ask about the lightning strike that hit you, that you describe while you were writing the book. And it wasn't because you were standing out in the middle of the field like Maria in the movie Twirling Around, but you were actually inside when this happened.
Yes, it was. I think they call it a secondary lightning strike. It must have come through the floor, and I had my hands on my computer, and my computer was plugged in, and it sort of shot up my arm and threw me out of my chair. Like I was back in my chair.
Wow.
And I was at an artist residency when that happened, and I went to one of the artists had an open studio where they were giving a talk, and I remember standing there the whole time, and my fingers were still tingling. Wow. And I was thinking, should I call someone? But it went away, as far as I know.
Good to know. So, in your summation of what you worked on for the book and your transition from a bad naturalist to, I think, a pretty good one now in your research.
I hope.
Are you seeing more insects visiting? Are you experiencing more? Are you achieving some of those goals you were looking for?
Well, yes. One very exciting thing happened, and that was this past spring. I saw a kestrel, an American kestrel, flying over the meadow, and they do a thing where they sort of hover and then they dive down after prey, and I saw it do that. And I was really excited because I hadn't seen any kestrels here, and kestrels are in decline, and they need a tall grass and a short grass environment, apparently, and that's what we have, so I'm hopeful. And we also heard a bobwhite quail in the field, and the bobwhite quail is, again, another ground bird that's in decline. So I was really hopeful about that. And we've seen a lot of woodcocks, which I hadn't seen the first 2 years, and they also are ground nesting birds. I don't think they're in decline, but I'm glad to have them either way. I heard a killdeer, which was very strange. And as far as insects, well, I guess I shouldn't talk about the spotted lanternflies, but that was, unfortunately, I had the first influx of spotted lanternflies this past summer, so that was bad. And I'm still getting rid of the ailanthus trees, the tree of heaven, which is their host tree. That is one of my big goals, to get rid of all of those trees, or as much as I can. We have seen... we had a lot of milkweed this past year, which a couple of years ago, it seemed like I was seeing less milkweed, and I was unhappy about that. But after some of the steps I took last winter to reduce the size of the shrubland that was developing, the milkweed came back, and I saw more monarchs this year. So I was very happy about that.
That's great to hear. Yeah, I've been hearing that people were seeing fewer monarchs this past year, so it's good to hear that in your part of the area that you were actually seeing an increase. Yes,
I was happy about that, and I'm always on the lookout for new insects. So I think I saw some. I've seen soldier beetles. I've seen a lot of. At the right time of year, the June beetle, the green June beetles, and carpenter bees, and the other solitary bees and minor bees. So it's all promising. It's going in the right direction.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Paula. Do you have any final thoughts to share with our listeners?
I guess if anyone would be interested in hearing or reading more about what's happening on the mountain, I have a newsletter. It's a free monthly newsletter called the Bad Naturalist newsletter, where I share more stories and discoveries from the mountain with lots of photos. And you can link to that on my website, which is paulawyman.com. You'll also find my events there. And I want to invite people to reach out to me through my contact page on my website, because I'm always happy to talk with readers and answer questions and visit book clubs and all of that. I really enjoy that. So
great. We'll share the link to the paulawyman.com it is.
Yes.
And the newsletter link as well in our show notes.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of their lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply. USAA.
Gazania plant profile. Treasure flower, Gazania species, is an annual or perennial plant with bright daisy-like flowers that bloom in shades of yellow, orange, red, pink, and white. The foliage is silvery gray-green with a fuzzy texture. Depending on the cultivar, it's hardy to USDA zones 4 to 10. Treasure flower prefers to grow in full sun and well-draining soils. It does especially well in containers such as terracotta pots. There are clumping and trailing varieties of Gazania that can be used as a ground cover in rock gardens or in mixed flower beds. It's beneficial to a number of pollinators. The flowers open in sunlight and close up tight in the shade or at night. The foliage is deer-resistant and the plant is drought-tolerant. It's native to South Africa. A quick warning that they are now considered an invasive weed in parts of Australia where they reseed easily. Treasure flower is very tough and low maintenance. Deadhead the spent blooms to keep it flowering from summer into fall. If it starts to get scraggly, just cut back the plant by about a third. There is no need to fertilize Gazania, but you may want to add extra mulch around the plants before the winter cold sets in. Treasure flower can be started by seed or by taking stem cuttings. Gazania, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, it's covered in a blanket of snow, and I have some witch hazel blooms and some winter jasmine, but still pretty bleak out there. In garden tips that we shared this past week, they all centered around snow in the garden. First, to note that snow is a great insulating layer, and to leave it alone and let it melt naturally and not to disturb plants that are weighed down by it unless you absolutely have to. Most of them will right themselves and be okay after the weight of the snow has been removed. GardenDC is part of a group of garden podcasts that have joined together to be a sponsor of one of the GardenCom winter webinar series, etc. And you can register for all 10 classes for just $99 by going to gardencom.org, and that's Garden, COMM. There are some fabulous presentations and speakers, and the group of 8 Garden Podcasts are super proud to be one of the sponsors of this series. Coming up for Washington Gardener, we have our annual seed exchanges for National Seed Swap Day, and that's Saturday, January 25th from 12:30 to 4 at Brookside Gardens in Wheaton, Maryland. You can register through washingtongardener.blogspot.com or go to eventbrite.com, or you can go to seedswapday.com and find the links there. These spots are filling up fast, so I recommend you do so quickly. And the Saturday after that, we are having an encore seed exchange at Green Spring Gardens, Saturday, February 1st. Same timing, same details. You can, again, register for that at those same links through our washingtongardener.blogspot.com, seedswapday.com, or Eventbrite, or by going directly to Green Spring Gardens website. You can join us for seed swapping, door prizes, plant tips, expert speaker, goodie bags, and much, much more. Happy gardening!
This is Christy Page with Green Prince with the last word on top gardening resolutions for 2025, an article by Dawn Nicholas. As the calendar flipped to 2025, gardeners around the globe were busy making resolutions to grow bigger, better, and more bountiful gardens this year. After scouring the world in a few garden centers, I've compiled a list of the top gardening resolutions for 2025. Now, these trends are rooted in humor, hope, and horticulture. So grab your gloves, dust off your trowel, and let's dig into what's in store for our gardens this year. Number 1, planting the unplantable. This year, gardeners are determined to prove that they can grow anything, even the plants that scoff at their sunny windowsills. 2, going native, the year of the indigenous garden. A growing number of gardeners are resolving to go native. No, not back to the land, but back to their roots of their local ecosystems. 3, no more neglect, the Water Me Please resolution. This year's motto, I will not forget to water. Number 4, compost like you mean it. In 2025, compost bins are getting a glow up, and gardeners are committing to creating a perfect compost concoction. Number 5, less lawn and more garden. The era of manicured golf course-like lawn is coming to an end, at least for the eco-conscious gardeners of 2025. Number 6, the Great Tomato Experiment. Every gardener knows the joy and heartbreak of growing tomatoes. This year, however, there's a resolution sweeping the community: grow the weirdest, wackiest tomato you can find. Number 7, garden like grandma, an heirloom revival. Now, heirloom seeds are making a big comeback as gardeners resolve to preserve the flavors and traditions of the past. Number 8, banish the bugs, but be kind about it. Gardeners are taking a kinder, gentler approach to pest control. Gone are the days of nuking the garden with chemicals. Instead, we're resolving to use natural methods to keep the creepy crawlers at bay. So there you have it, 8 resolutions to inspire your gardening journey in 2025. Whether you're planting something new, going native, or simply remembering to water your plants, this year promises to be one filled with growth, joy, and maybe a few surprises in the garden. Happy gardening! This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at greenprince.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes, or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to washingtongardener.com or washingtongardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest. and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.